Good morning. We must always conform to our pattern. We are speaking now of healing, spiritual healing. And this is a point that we must never forget. Spiritual healing has nothing whatsoever to do with God. It has to do with the consciousness of an individual who is a healer. Now let me show you this. Before there was a Jesus Christ, there was a God. But there were little or no healings. A few by Moses, a few by Elijah and Elisha, and that's almost the end of all the healing works of which we have any knowledge in Judeo-Christian history before the Master. In the Orient, the only spiritual healing of which we have any knowledge is that of Gautama the Buddha and his immediate disciples. And they all had this principle. It was revealed, that was the secret that was revealed to Gautama under the Bodhi tree. The same secret that was revealed to Jesus the Christ. Now, there was a God before there was a Gautama. There was a God before there was a Gautama the Buddha. But there were no healings. And so, it isn't God that is responsible for the healings. It is the consciousness of an individual who brings himself into oneness with God consciousness. In other words, it is God manifest as the consciousness of an individual, as the fourth dimensional consciousness, or what is called the Christ consciousness of an individual. God is always God. Before Abraham was, God is, but God did no healing works. It took an Abraham to found a Jewish nation. It took a Moses enlightened on the mountain to bring the Hebrews out of the slavery of Pharaoh. Now, there was a God before there was a Moses, but for centuries the Hebrews were left in abject slavery, ignorance, illiteracy, no culture, no religion, nothing but an inner hope that their one God would save them, which their one God did nothing at all about. But when Moses attained God realization, from the moment that he attained Christ consciousness, that one enlightened individual, that one Christ consciousness of Moses, could lead the entire Hebrew nation out of its slavery. Now, in the same way, at the time that Jesus Christ began his ministry in the Holy Lands, there was a tremendous Hebrew church. In fact, the temple was there in Jerusalem, an enormous temple with hundreds of rabbis and lots of devotion to Sabbath and lots of sacrifices and lots of tithes, but no healing, no evidence of God's grace, no evidence that there is such a thing as God's grace for mankind. And then comes one individual who attains Christ consciousness. And he is no longer Yeshua bar Joseph. He is no longer Yeshua the son of Joseph. Now he is Yeshua the Messiah, or in English, Jesus the Christ. Jesus the Christed one. Jesus the enlightened one. So you see that as long as a man is Jesus, son of Joseph, he is not a healer. As long as Gautama is the son of a rich king, he is not a healer. But when Gautama becomes the Buddha, when Jesus becomes the Christ, then the healing works follow. And those healing works, or carrying a nation into freedom, or saving them from disaster, all of this is the direct manifestation of Christ consciousness appearing through or as an individual. Now, whenever such a master finds a student, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 12, sufficiently ready for a God experience, a Christ experience, that master can take that student or those students and lift them up to a measure of his own consciousness. Gautama did this, and he soon had a following of disciples who traveled all of India and made the consciousness of Gautama known, and through this they healed and formed the system that is called ashramas. The ashramas that were built all over India, to which people came for study and for healing. In the same way, Christ Jesus found those whom he felt were ready to dedicate themselves to the Christ life, and he said to them, "Leave your nets and follow me." And they did. You must remember that in doing that, they sacrificed their way of earning a living. They gave up concern as to what they shall eat or what they shall drink or whether they shall be clothed. They gave up all regular modes of living, family life, community life, social life. Virtually, they left this world to follow him. And he raised them to some measure of Christ consciousness so that they in turn could heal and teach and regenerate. Of course, he could not lift them to his own level of consciousness, for no one can do this. That is the work of every individual themselves. The teacher can lift the student out of their own level of human consciousness, but they cannot lift the student into the fullness of the Christ, for that is an individual task that each one must perform for themselves. And so we find that at the time of the persecution and the crucifixion, that all of the disciples fell short. Not one of them measured up to Christhood. Not one of them even measured up to the ability to stand fast with the Master. Not one of them measured up to the point of standing with him or protecting him or in any way being of a help to him. In other words, in plain English, they deserted him. and all ran for their holes to protect themselves. Self-preservation being the first law of human nature, they forgot even the measure of Christhood that they attained, and they ran back to being humans again, like Lot's wife, looking back to the state of consciousness which she had already outgrown, but which still had some attraction for her. Well, in the case of Peter, John, some of the others, the lapse was a temporary one, and they quickly recovered themselves and again became disciples. And they again followed the spiritual path, and they suffered the persecutions which inevitably come to those who identify themselves with a spiritual cause. And however, Judas, as you know, did not make a recovery, at least on this plane of consciousness, and some of the others never amounted to much, but a few did go out and fulfill their function as disciples. Now, if they, as fishermen and tax collectors and so forth, could be lifted to a state of consciousness which could heal, which could preach the gospel and draw men unto them, then you must understand, again, that it is the state of consciousness of an individual that does this. God is always God. God was God before Abraham was. God was God before the heathens were. God was God from the beginning of time. But the fact of God is of no benefit to the world except in proportion as an individual first and then the spread raise themselves to conscious union with God, and thereby become a transparency through which the presence and power of God can operate in human consciousness. Now, I can give you an example of what I mean. Shut all these windows and put blinds over them, and you have locked the sunshine out. There is sunshine, it is shining, it is light, it is warm, and it is present. But it is of no use to you until you open the blinds, open the windows, make a transparency through which the sun can reach you. So it is with God. God is, and God is omnipotence. God is omnipresence. God is omniscience. God is the all-power of good. But all of this is only of avail to us as we open our consciousness and become transparencies through which God can shine. Then every individual who attains that union with God, even in a measure such as a grain of sand, such an individual becomes a blessing, first to their very own families, to their communities, to those who seek them, and eventually, like Gautama, like Jesus, like John, like Paul, eventually to the world. One individual can save the entire world. One individual, completely at one with God, can be the instrument or transparency through which so much truth would flow to the world that even though it first became manifest in his own home, and then in his community, and then with some friends, patients, students, eventually it would flow out over the whole world. And then, as others caught the fire, as others became ignited, as others were led to consecrate themselves to God, then we would find a second one, and a dozen, and 6 dozen, and 100, and 1,000. And so you would find that truth would encircle the world, and in just a few generations, the world would be free. You might ask there, and probably should ask, if this is so, why wasn't the world saved through Gautama the Buddha, who was 500 years B.C.? Why wasn't the world saved through Jesus Christ, who had this message in its fullness? And the answer is this. Number one, while the Master could give this to his immediate disciples, it is evident that neither in the case of Gautama the Buddha nor that of Jesus the Christ, not one of the disciples could give it to another. In other words, they raised up no one to carry on the message. The Master himself was able to reach the consciousness of Paul, Saul of Tarsus, who became St. Paul, and later he was able to reach the consciousness of John, who wrote Revelation. But the disciples have left no students. The disciples of Gautama the Buddha left no students. In fact, Lao Tzu left only 2 students, and only one of these was a master, and neither of those left any students. And so the message was not able to be carried forward because of a lack of transmission. But now we are faced with an entirely different proposition. Today we have books, which they never had. So there's no printing press. We have books, we have radio, we have television, we have mode and means of communication, and not only that, we have jet planes to carry people to all parts of the globe in a few hours, so that a truth that is spoken here on Maui today, a few weeks from now will be heard in Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and in England and in France and in Switzerland and Germany. In other words, today the message that is voiced in one place in the globe quickly reaches every place in the globe, and the means of igniting consciousness now, of setting humans afire with a zeal and a devotion to God, is so multiplied that there can be no question now but what a few generations from now this world won't be recognized. You'll never believe in those days that the world was anything like it is today, because truth is being accepted, being assimilated in consciousness, and this develops. It may not be necessary to develop a Christ, that is, an individual with the full and complete God consciousness. If only some thousands have a grain of it, it will do more work than one full and complete Christ could do. although it would take that one full and complete Christ to set the flame in motion. Now, I come back again to the start of this. Remember, God already is, and so there is no use of asking God to do something. There is no use of waiting for God to do something. And there's no use of praying to God, because God does not enter the world through the human mind. If God could enter this world and establish grace through the human mind, it would have been done in these many hundreds of years in which we have had churches on every street corner. God enters the human scene through consciousness. The consciousness of an individual or a million individuals. There's no limit to the number, for God is no respecter of persons. But always it is the individual through whom God appears. God consciousness appears. It is for this reason that when you are seeking a spiritual healing, you don't go to a department store, you don't go to a supermarket, you go to a spiritual healer. Why? If God were doing it, why not go to anybody at all? Why not go to any minister, priest, or rabbi, if God were doing it? The answer is, God is only doing it as the consciousness of the individual who has attained spiritual consciousness in some measure. Therefore, healing works take place, first of all, in proportion to the degree of realized consciousness of the practitioner. Why then is there a difference between one patient of a practitioner who gets an instantaneous healing and the next patient who receives it in a week, and the next one who may take a year? And here the difference is in the consciousness of the patient. This has been, I'm giving you this out of my own experience now of 30 years in the healing work. This is what I have found. That the greater the preparation of an individual for spiritual healing, the better, the quicker the healing. Now, I don't mean by that one person humanly is better than another or better prepared, because that is not my meaning. An individual is in no wise responsible for the degree of their preparedness for healing. It is something that is beyond the realm of the individual to control. In other words, it is the old saying, I am what I am, and I can't be other than I am. And therefore, we are all at a certain level of consciousness when we come to this work. Some, for one reason or another, are more receptive and responsive to healing than others. And for no reason that they themselves have anything to do with. In other words, it has been stated over and over again that it is far easier to heal an atheist than it is a good Christian or a good Hebrew or a good Buddhist. And that is absolutely true. I think any of us in this work would rather have a good, healthy atheist for a patient than a religionist. And the reason is that the atheist at least is free of superstition, and the others aren't. It is in the same way that it's far easier to heal a sinner than it is a saint. A sinner begins with humility. A sinner knows their own shortcomings. And usually the saint is so puffed up with the idea of how good he is and what sacrifices he's made to be good that you can't break through, at least not quickly. So the point is this: the person who has the quick healings need not get puffed up about it, because, first of all, it may be entirely due to the state of consciousness of the practitioner at the moment of the healing, or it may be due to their own readiness with which they had nothing to do consciously, and for which they can take no credit. And on the other hand, those who are slower in receiving their healings must never indulge self-condemnation, but must remember this principle: in proportion as they develop their spiritual consciousness, the healings will take place. And when they take place, they will not only be of a permanent nature, but they will also bring with it the ability to help others. That is one of the great benefits of the slow healings, that they develop consciousness and prepare the patient to become no longer a patient, but one who can help others. When I speak of practitioners, please don't believe that I mean by that people who give up their way of life to become professional practitioners. I mean by practitioner those individuals who have the capacity to help others. They need not give up their business or art or other careers as long as they are willing to hold themselves in readiness to respond to a call for help when it comes. The major part of our work is the development of spiritual consciousness, and the entire purpose of our writings and recordings is to show how this consciousness is developed. When Dr. Jung said or wrote that he has never had the case of a person over 35 whose disease was not caused by a falling away from the original concept of religion, nor has he ever had a healing except through the patient's return to the practice of religion in its original sense, by which he meant that he was not talking of church religion. He was talking of an individual's return to God consciousness, which has no relationship whatsoever to any formal sense of religion. Now, it is likewise true in our experience that even those who have healings through practitioners have gained nothing if they have only gained the healing. Because, as the Master warned, they can have worse things come upon them if they return to the same state of consciousness that brought it on. Or removing one evil might make room for 7. If there hasn't been a change of consciousness along with it. That is why this work can never be thought of as supplanting materia medica. This work can never be thought of as taking the place of materia medica or being in competition with materia medica. All such ideas are based wholly on ignorance. There is no claim in spiritual healing that you can just take a sick person and make them well. And the reason is that spiritual healing involves first a transformation of consciousness. Be transformed by the renewing of the mind. Then all of the outer harmonies take place. But for any individual to believe for a moment that a spiritual ministry is just to take sick people and make them well is to misunderstand this entire work. The interest of a spiritual ministry is the regeneration of an individual, the resurrection of an individual from material sense to spiritual consciousness. The healing of the body or of the purse is the secondary effect of the major premise. In other words, no person who understands the spiritual ministry will ever accept the challenge, why don't you go in the hospitals and empty out all the beds there? That is not our function. Not that it would be possible, although a great many could be freed, but that is not our function, merely to make sick people well. Our function is to bring about a transformation of consciousness from material sense to spiritual consciousness, and then finding that health, harmony, wholeness, completeness are the added things, or they are the outpicturing of the spiritual consciousness. It is for this reason that whenever we are asked for help, instead of just saying, oh yes, we'll heal you and send you a bill, we usually say, yes, we will give you help, and here is a book to read. Now, the object isn't to sell a book. The object isn't even to sell 1,000,000 books, because those who have attained spiritual consciousness have no need of selling books for their livelihood. They have touched the source of supply. Therefore, they need not sell books or engage in any other activity for their support. But the object of placing the books in the hands of the patient is that they can begin instantly to experience a transformation of consciousness, to give up fears, all of which come through materialism, and to be transformed into confidence, assurance. Let us illustrate that for a moment. As you know, there is neither time nor space in God. Both time and space are material concepts. But now just remember that all fears have to do with the future. There's no such thing as a fear about the present. Fear has to do with tonight, tomorrow, next week, next year, an hour from now. Fear has nothing to do with this moment. For this moment, we're all right. It is what will happen an hour from now. A person who has a cold and fears it isn't fearing the cold, they're fearing the possibility of pneumonia. It is always a future tense that we fear. A person with a disease doesn't fear the disease, they're fearing the death that may be the consequence of the disease. And so it is that nothing can remove fear from an individual as long as they are living in a future tense. And there is no way to stop them living in the future tense until they have acquired the spiritual consciousness. Now, in what way does spiritual consciousness remove our fears and then remove the effects of our fears? It is in this way. The very moment the tiniest bit of spiritual light comes to an individual, they become aware of the teaching of Christ Jesus. And in one way or another, their attention is brought to this. Before Abraham was, I am. I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. As I was with Abraham, so I am with you. I will be with you unto the end of the world. Fear not, it is I. Fear not, it is I. I am ever with thee. Fear not for what you shall eat, or drink, or wherewithal you shall be clothed, for I am the bread, and I am the meat, and I will never leave thee. I can set a table for thee in the wilderness. I am the light unto thy feet. I am ever with thee. How can you ever avoid me? If you mount up to heaven, I am there. If you make your bed in hell, I am there. If you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you need not fear, for I am there. I am the resurrection, and I am thy life. Fear not, it is I. And as you relax in that, you are consciously aware of this truth, that you are not living your own life. You are not depending on your own wisdom. You are not living on your own strength. You are not living by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. And every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God has that I with it. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. I am thy bread, and I am thy wine. And so you get to living with this presence that is within you, who has named itself I. I am. And you are never again alone. You cannot fear what mortal man can do to you. You cannot fear what mortal conditions can do to you. You can never fear what germs can do to you, or unemployment, or atomic bombs, because there is that saying unto you, I made the manna fall for Moses. I opened the Red Sea. I made a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. I fed Elijah in the wilderness, even sent ravens carrying food. Through the Master, I fed the multitudes in the wilderness, healed the multitudes on every occasion. Fear not, it is I in the midst of you, and I will never leave you nor forsake you. And now you see, you no longer have material consciousness, because material consciousness was concerned only with fearing everything or anything external to oneself. Spiritual consciousness has to do with the assurance of an inner being, an inner presence that was with you before the cradle and will be with you after the grave. Then you walk through life without fear. It would make no difference then if you have a temporary illness or unemployment or lack. It would make no difference then if you had a disease or were facing death, for you would say, no one in the history of the world has lived on this plane beyond 70 years and 10 or 20 or 30 or 40. Therefore, we know that the day is coming when we will leave this plane of consciousness, but will we leave God? No. And if we have God, does it make any difference whether we're on this side or that side? Whether it's this side of our birth or that side of our so-called death? No. What would be horrible would be the idea of even being here without the presence and power of a God. Who would want to remain here without God? And why? Only because they fear what is coming. That is why so many people cling to life long after they've become a burden to the whole world, including themselves. They still cling to life because they fear what lies ahead. And would they fear what lies ahead if they had ever had an assurance, I am with you, fear not, it is I. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. I will be with thee unto the end of the world. This is spiritual consciousness, and this is the consciousness that now has attained a grain of spiritual light and can become a healer. You see, God was there always, but the healing couldn't come even with a God until an individual became God-conscious. And becoming God-conscious, that makes them a transparency through which and as which the healing grace of God can touch the human race. When the grace of God touches the consciousness of an individual, it isn't alone physical healing that follows, nor mental healing, nor moral healing. It is a healing of all relationships. It is a healing of relationships at every level of life. It is a healing of one's whole being. In other words, it removes the individual from material fears to spiritual assurances. So you see that a spiritual ministry acknowledges God as the life of all being of this universe, as the food, as the supply, as the support, as the maintenance, as the health of our countenance. But it says that this is of no avail, except as the presence and power of God finds outlet through the consciousness of those individuals who have in some degree or other brought themselves into at one-ment with their source. It isn't too difficult because the kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom of God is closer to you than breathing and nearer than hands and feet. So we don't have to go off to Tibet to find it, or to India, or to Rome, or to Boston. It is where we are, the place whereon thou standest, is holy ground. The difficulty is that after you know this, it does take these periods of inspiration, meditation, contemplation, to bring this presence of God into conscious expression. Then with this conscious oneness with God, this conscious union with God, now the presence and power of God has an outlet. And now it can flow to everyone in this room and everyone beyond. One of the most magnificent experiences of how this operates, one of the most wonderful experiences that have come to my own personal attention, is in the years gone by watching the work of Father Divine. That man had thousands of followers, and as you know, and as the police records will bear witness, there was a great deal of dishonesty, pilfering, and one thing and another, certainly a great deal of immorality, and smoking, and drinking, and gambling. But within days of an individual coming in contact with Father Divine, their smoking dropped away, their drinking dropped away, their pilfering dropped away, their immoralities dropped away, and you saw a group of people, really not only surprising is too mild a word, shocking is really the word. It was a transformation almost impossible to believe. And many years later, the warden of the prison at Riker Island, which was just off of the Bronx and off of Harlem where Father Divine operated, said that in years they had not had a single Negro there who was a follower of Father Divine. And the credit managers in the stores said that never did they have to repossess an article purchased on time payment by a follower of Father Divine. And throughout the Depression, none of Father Divine's followers ever had to take government relief. They always were able to demonstrate their own supply. Now, this is the activity of the Christ flowing through one individual and touching the consciousness of all those who attune themselves with it. There are other examples. There are examples in India of masters who carry their whole following through their lifetime in health and harmony. The sadness of all of that, though, is that the followers do not learn the principles. And then when the master's gone, their situation is apt to be a little worse than it was before, because now they have known freedom and cannot maintain it. It was for this reason that the master taught the principles and said, if I go not away, the Comforter will not come to you. It is for this reason that we have not set up a ministry in the Infinite Way whereby any one or any dozen carry the demonstrations of the students permanently. Those of us who actively engage in healing work are perfectly willing to help any student on the way, but always with the understanding that the student is making every effort to learn the principles, to attain their own conscious union with God, and be a transparency so that they need never say, you've taken my God away. In other words, you've made your own conscious contact with God. It is the function of the Infinite Way, first, to reveal that the developed spiritual consciousness of an individual is a Savior. Second, to show him how to attain that consciousness. Third, to help him with his problems and in the attaining of that consciousness until he has arrived. And fourth, to help free the world of the states of limitation which continue to bind it. This should make it clear to you why there is a tremendous responsibility upon the shoulders of every Infinite Way student. Because being a receiver of its grace is only a first step. There must quickly follow that period in which they become doers. In other words, they must, as rapidly as possible, attain, if it's only a grain of this measure of light, this freedom from fear. Because that's the beginning of spiritual wisdom, is freedom from fear. And freedom from fear cannot come while there is something to be feared. It can only come through the realization that there is only one power, that is God power, and it is within me. I carry it with me wherever I go. The only God power there is goes with me, up in the plane, down in the submarine, out to sea to swim, on the roads in the automobiles. Where I go, the presence and power of God goes with me, for it is closer to me than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. Yea, the kingdom of God is neither low here nor low there. It is within you, and fear can never be taken from you until you have come to that realization. Then you can say, surely I could walk into the lion's cage if necessary. I won't do it as a stunt, but if it's necessary, I can do it because the kingdom of God is within me, and it will be with me in that cage. It will not leave me nor forsake me. It will be with me unto the end of the world. It will be with me if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And then fear has to disappear, because there is nothing left to fear. Just think, we've come to the end of 4 of these sessions again. One minute you're wondering how it's going to start, and the next minute you are wondering how it ever finished. But it does. And we have made reservations so that we will be over here for the 8th and 9th of January. Yes, right? 8th and 9th of January. Thank you.